In the early hours of June 6, 1944, Normandy became a scene of horror and ambition. As ships crossed the salty waters, Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in history, prepared to unleash carnage. More than 160,000 soldiers were mobilized that day. But what unfolded was an elaborate deception that led the Nazis to expect the attack in Calais, far from the actual landing beaches. The first moments of D-Day were chaotic in a way. Allied troops faced fierce German resistance from Omaha to Sword. In Omaha, the sea turned red with the blood of more than 3,000 American soldiers in a single day. Despite the casualties, the Allies managed to establish a beachhead that would mark the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. However, this victory did not come without a devastating price. More than 10,000 Allied casualties and between 4,000 and 9,000 Germans killed in action. The brutality did not stop on the battlefield. Several German prisoners, often young men barely out of adolescence, became the target of cruel reprisals. Summary executions became a practice among Allied soldiers who, burdened with the weight of Europe's suffering, sought revenge for years of oppression. The war had transformed those men into monsters. The line between good and bad blurred in the fog of conflict. French civilians also played their part in this macabre theatre. The streets became scenes of public lynchings against collaborators, while trapped German soldiers knew their fate was sealed. There would be no mercy. As Allied troops advanced toward Paris, liberation was only a temporary climax in a narrative filled with suffering and sacrifice. D-Day was not only a military milestone, it was a chilling reminder that both the Allies and the Axis were stained by war crimes. History does not remember only the heroes. It also remains silent about the innocents whose lives were taken in the name of a victory that could never erase the horror of the conflict. Executions without trial, the shadow of war after the landing. The first days of June 1944 carried with them a dense air, laden with desperation and vengeance. The men of the 7th Army, weary and aged by years of battle, looked towards the horizon with their rusted rifles as the Allies landed on the beaches of Normandy. Those soldiers of the Reich, mostly conscripted by force, hailed from distant lands like Turkestan and Mongolia, carrying the fury of an empire that wasn't theirs. The Allies, for their part, seemed to come to impose justice with every step they took. And although their treatment of German prisoners generally complied with international law, there were silences between the gunfire. That day, the human tide advanced relentlessly, driven by the promise of liberating an oppressed Europe. But with that promise also came horror, the kind that covers the decisions of men forged by hatred, fear, and the brutality of war. One example of the massacres was the Battle of Juno Beach, which occurred on the first day of the operation. The landing crafts, battered by unforgiving waves, barely managed to stay on course. The soldiers, trembling but determined, looked at the fortified shore where the 716th German Infantry Division waited with deadly patience, protected by bunkers and mines hidden under the wet sand. At 7:35, the 1st Canadian troops touched the beach. Despite prior artillery bombardment and air raids, the German defences were relentless. The Sherman tanks, struggling to stay afloat in the rough sea, finally made land, breaking through enemy lines and opening a path for the troops, though at too high a cost. Canadian casualties began to pile up, lifeless bodies floating among the waves, mingled with the twisted iron of the destroyed defences. The Germans, although entrenched and protected, could not withstand the Allied push for much longer. The beach, which had been their stronghold, became their ruin. The sand turned red, and by the evening Hitler's forces already knew that something had irreparably broken at Juno Beach. In just a few hours, approximately 1,200 Germans fell in that battle. But the executions of German prisoners were not decisions made calmly. In reality, most of the time they were impulsive acts, dictated by the circumstances of the battle. The Allied soldiers, especially the Canadians, were singled out for these actions throughout the landing. More than once, after the surrender of German soldiers instead of being taken captive, they found themselves staring down the barrel of a gun. The idea was simple. Those men, who were now raising their hands in surrender, had been firing on the Allies just hours before. Who was to say they wouldn't do it again if given the chance? We couldn't afford to be compassionate, was a sentiment heard among veterans who, years later, recalled those days. Some justified it as an act of prevention, others as a response to prior atrocities committed by the Germans, particularly by the feared SS Panzer Division. For many, the only way to ensure those soldiers wouldn't return to the front was to take their lives right then and there. A clear example of these actions was what occurred in the forest of Saint-Lambert in August 1944. There, Canadian forces managed to capture a considerable number of German soldiers after fierce fighting. It is said that amid the confusion and fatigue of battle, some of those prisoners were executed. One incident involved a Canadian tank that, either by mistake or perhaps out of desperation, fired on a group of prisoners that had been captured just minutes earlier. The scene was brutal, bodies scattered among the trees, the ground soaked in blood and gunpowder. The truth is that chaos did not distinguish between sides, it simply manifested itself. While both Allied and German troops committed executions, the French resistance was no exception. In their fight to liberate their land from Nazi oppression, the Maquis, as they were known, took justice into their own hands. It wasn't uncommon to hear of German soldiers captured by the resistance, only to be executed later without trial or interrogation. One of the most well-known events related to the resistance was the incident involving nearly 50 Nazis captured in Tulle. The dilemma was clear. Keeping those men alive was an impossible task. There were neither resources nor security to guarantee they wouldn't escape. The orders were swift and precise. All of them were to be executed. The German soldiers were forced to dig their own graves before being shot. The faces of the French fighters, hardened by years of struggle, could not hide the mixture of hatred and sorrow they felt as they pulled the trigger. The event finally took place on June 12th. Of course, each side had its own justifications. Revenge for the atrocities suffered was a recurring argument. The logic that a freed German soldier would return to the front to kill more Allies was another widely used justification. But behind every execution, there was something deeper, the desire to control an environment that had completely escaped any exercise of reason. In a place where death lurked at every step, killing a prisoner could, ironically, feel like a way to guarantee one's own survival. Many of the soldiers who participated in the executions carried that weight for the rest of their lives. A Canadian veteran, in an interview years later, recounted how, after shooting a German prisoner, a fleeting thought crossed his mind. What's the difference between them and me now? Some spoke of the fear and confusion they felt on the battlefield, where decisions had to be made in seconds. We couldn't afford to hesitate because hesitating could cost us our lives, one of them said. Others, however, expressed regret, acknowledging that despite the brutality of war, killing an unarmed enemy was still an act that haunted their conscience. Morality in times of war seems to dissolve, vanished by the deafening noise of explosions and screams. German prisoners, those who raised their hands in surrender, were often not seen as men but as enemies, pieces on a deadly chessboard. And although many of them were treated in accordance with the laws of war, compassion was a luxury few could afford. Revenge on the sand, the dark side of the Normandy Landings. Without a doubt, what many did not imagine about the Normandy Landings was that the battle for freedom would bring with it a dark chapter of violence and revenge, where justice and retribution intertwined in a disturbing way. The initial landings, especially at Omaha, were chaos. In the distance, the waves crashed, but there was no way to prepare for what was to come. The American forces advanced, trusting that the Allied bombardments had done their job. However, the smoke had not managed to conceal the harsh truth. The 352nd German Infantry Division lay in wait, intact, with machine guns ready, cannons in place, and the confidence of those who know they have the upper hand. The sea, in its silent betrayal, diverted the landing craft. The meticulously planned strategy for that location began to unravel before the soldiers even set foot on land. The strong currents threw them directly into the most dangerous sectors, those that should, in theory, have already been leveled. But the bombardments, as precise as a broken promise, had failed, leaving the German positions as firm as they had been up until that moment. The first waves of soldiers, still clinging to the hope of a quick advance, found themselves immediately in hell. In a matter of minutes, 90% of the men were cut down, with no time to organize, no time even to process the horror unfolding around them. Officers fell one by one, and command disintegrated like sand slipping through fingers. While engineers fought to clear obstacles and carve a path through mines and barbed wire, the beach became a death trap. The chaos was absolute, organization a distant dream. Allied soldiers ran towards the beach, stumbling over the bodies of their fallen comrades. Amidst the carnage, the official orders regarding the treatment of prisoners seemed to dissolve in the echo of the explosions. The mission was clear: defeat the enemy. But how was the pent-up anger of hundreds of men who had witnessed unspeakable horrors to be managed? The war crimes committed by German forces were fresh in memory. They were there, just beneath the surface, for those who chose to look. And for many soldiers, the idea of capturing and treating the enemy humanely didn't seem to fit with the brutal reality. In fact, months later, one of the most significant events occurred after the Normandy massacre. 84 American soldiers, captured by German troops, were lined up and executed in cold blood. Although it happened after D-Day, that event reflected what occurred when one side gained control. They were often ruthless. Some unofficial higher-ups began to circulate orders that, while not written, were tacit. No prisoners would be taken, especially if they belonged to the feared SS. This simple mandate, transmitted in whispers and stern looks, would turn the beaches of Normandy into the scene of brutal reprisals. On one occasion, a group of American soldiers captured several dozen German soldiers. The latter, trembling and with their hands raised, were forced to dig their own graves under the watchful eyes of the rifles. Silence reigned, interrupted only by the sound of shovels hitting the earth. No one spoke, no one begged. It was as if the fate of those men had been sealed from the moment they raised their hands in surrender. Minutes later, the bullets completed the grim task. The collapse of moral lines did not stop there. As Allied troops advanced through the region, reports of summary executions increased. On January 1, 1945, members of the U.S. 11th Armored Division executed 80 German soldiers in the village of Chenogne. The winter cold covered the scene, and the shadows of the fallen bodies stretched out beneath the dim light of dawn. It was a true reflection that war didn't just dehumanize the enemy, but also the victors. Amid this chaos, which doesn't represent everything that happened to the German soldiers captured by the Allied army during those days, uncomfortable questions arose. Where was the line that separated justice from revenge? What was the difference between the atrocities committed by the Nazis and the reprisals carried out by the Allies? The answer was blurry, lost in the fog of Normandy. Above all, it wasn't easy to answer. The highest-ranking officers tried to maintain control, though they knew that the situation often slipped out of their hands. The post-war trials would focus on punishing Nazi criminals, but the acts of Allied soldiers were rarely addressed with the same force. In a total war, where good and evil seemed clear on the surface, and the central goal was the elimination of the adversary, the deeper waters were full of contradictions. As the weeks passed, the war continued, unstoppable and blind. On a hill near Caen, a Canadian soldier watched through his binoculars. He had witnessed more than 100 of his compatriots executed by the forces of the 12th SS Panzer Division. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see the faces of his friends disfigured by bullets, and hearing their blood-choked screams wasn't an easy task. So when they captured a small group of German soldiers, he didn't think twice. He aimed his weapon without saying a word and fired. Blood flowed again, seeking its course in the theater of operations. But this time there was no satisfaction, only an endless void. The war continued, relentless, as soldiers, civilians and prisoners were caught in its merciless vortex. Allied High Command, silence and complicity in the face of war crimes. The day had begun early on the beaches of Normandy. The mist, almost ghostly, slid over the coast as Allied soldiers descended from the landing craft, ready to face an unyielding enemy. In such a scene, the morale of many soldiers depended on their ability to dehumanize the enemy, transforming German soldiers into mere beasts that had to be put down without hesitation. The eyes of a young recruit barely distinguished the figures moving in front of him, and when he finally encountered a German soldier raising his hands in surrender, there was no room for mercy. The unwritten order circulated among the soldiers. If you captured a German, they became a logistical problem, one that no one was willing to deal with amid the crossfire. It sounds cruel, but often there was neither the time nor the will to complicate things with prisoners. In that environment, as often as it may have happened, the execution of German soldiers became an instinctive response. born from pent-up hatred and the brutality of war. In a corner of the battlefield, far from the eyes of the press, the laws of war sometimes dissolved like blood in the mud. Dwight David Eisenhower, from his headquarters, was not necessarily aware of absolutely everything happening on the battlefield. However, the priorities were clear. The focus was on gaining ground, on breaking German defenses at any cost, before they could regroup. The ethical question was present, but it wasn't always possible to uphold it as the advance continued. Perhaps Eisenhower knew that delving into such thorny issues could demoralize his troops, undermine the good image of the Allied army, and worse, slow down the offensive. "The success of this operation depends on the conduct of every man," he had once confidently said. But the reality of war was much harsher. Meanwhile, George Smith Patton, the general known for his impetuous character and iron hand, had no time for indulgence. Though he never said it explicitly, his mantra resonated among the ranks: "I will not tolerate any soldier who doesn't fight." Under this umbrella of ferocity, many soldiers found justification for making decisions in the heat of combat that under other circumstances would be unthinkable. Then there was Bernard Law Montgomery, the shrewd British general, who observed the situation with cold calculation. For him, it all came down to one thing: winning. "The only thing that matters is winning," he said repeatedly without hesitation. That statement, as devoid of ethical nuance as it was overflowing with commitment and determination, encapsulated the mindset with which the High Command approached reports of executions. It was better not to stir up the mud too much and let the soldiers do what they deemed necessary to achieve the objectives. In the trenches, the justification for brutal actions found its footing in the enemy's acts. The Germans were not seen as mere soldiers. They were the ones responsible for the atrocities in Europe, the executioners of millions. The humanity of German soldiers disappeared before the eyes of the Allies, transforming them into abstract enemies deserving the worst of fates. And when the chaos of combat allowed it, a shot at a German prisoner was for many seen as revenge for the crimes that the regime they defended with arms had perpetrated. In the weeks following the landings, rumors of German soldier executions at the hands of the resistance spread like wildfire. In small villages, far from the spotlight, executions were carried out with a mixture of fury and relief. It was wild justice, devoid of formalities. The Allied soldiers who had come to France as liberators found themselves caught up in a whirlwind of violence that didn't always distinguish between what was just and what wasn't. Despite any narratives held today, the lines separating heroes from villains blurred, and acts of cruelty were buried beneath the flag of victory. However, history is written every day. The echoes of those bloody days in Normandy persisted for years, even as the Allies returned victorious. The Nuremberg trials, held at the end of the war, brought with them a bitter irony. While Nazi leaders were tried for war crimes, the Allies themselves carried their secrets. The executions of German prisoners and the crimes committed in the heat of battle remained buried under layers of heroism and official narrative. But history, like the wind that blew across the beaches of Normandy, refuses to stay silent. Decades later, reports began to surface, testimonies from soldiers who could no longer bear the weight of what they had done or what they had seen. Accounts of cold-blooded executions, unwritten orders, and complicit glances that faded like the moon at dawn. The generals, who had chosen to look the other way, went down in history as the strategists who liberated Europe. But the shadows of those forbidden acts remained, persisting in the memories of those who had been there. This wasn't the fate of all Nazis captured during that operation. The High Command, like many soldiers, was committed to respecting the laws of war. However, there were always shameful exceptions: historical memory and deliberate forgetting, the secrets of D-Day. As soon as they touched land on beaches whose names would go down in history, Omaha, Utah, Juneau, Gold, Sword, the bombs began to fall with relentless precision. The deafening sound of explosions and the incessant whirring of bullets painted the landscape with a chaos that seemed endless. The narrative of history, the one we all know, elevates them as defenders of freedom, fighting against an absolute evil. Nazism, with its countless horrors, had given them the perfect justification to continue the war. But behind the curtain of smoke, between the glory and heroism we've been told about, there were also moments that blurred that image. International treaties of the time set clear rules about war, For example, the Third Geneva Convention of 1929 clearly outlined how prisoners of war should be treated, but reality would soon prove that paper is more fragile than bullets. When the first soldiers began falling into enemy hands, the agreement seemed to falter. According to the rules, any combatant who fell in battle was to be treated humanely, without distinction of race, religion, or nationality. However, on the battlefield, humanity seemed as distant a word as peace itself. Members of militias and organized resistance movements, who, according to the conventions, enjoyed the same protections as regular soldiers, discovered that the line between what was permitted and what was done in reality was as blurry as the fog on a morning of battle. Captured, they were granted the dubious honor of being brought before tribunals to determine whether they were prisoners of war or simply enemies without rights. The convention also required that the wounded be repatriated if their injuries were severe. But in the midst of chaos, who stopped to examine a soldier's scars? Trains loaded with bodies continued their course, while the doctors, their hands tied by the war, could barely differentiate those who should be sent back home from those who would never return. Reprisals were prohibited, or at least that's what the treaty said. However, when soldiers were taken prisoner, they often became pawns in a larger war, punished not for their actions but for simply wearing the wrong uniform. The Allies, upon landing, were aware of these rules and, for the most part, tried to adhere to them. Captured German soldiers were generally treated as prescribed. They were provided with food, water, and shelter. At least, that was the theory. In practice, history took a different course in some cases. In Omaha, Allied casualties were so high that troop morale hit rock bottom. Some American soldiers, blinded by hatred and pain, took reprisals. Germans attempting to surrender were not always considered prisoners of war. Instead, they became targets for summary executions. However, the most disturbing thing about all this is what is not mentioned. The war crimes committed by the Allies do not occupy the front pages of history books. The Allied bombs, those launched with the intent of destroying German fortifications, did not always hit their targets. Military objectives shared space with churches, schools, and hospitals. Civilians caught in the crossfire suffered the same ill fate. The destruction was indiscriminate, but always justified under the umbrella of collateral damage, a term that softens death and turns it into an inevitable effect of war. The streets of small French towns, once vibrant and full of life, became improvised cemeteries. The rubble mingled with the bodies of those who hadn't managed to escape in time. Amid the ruins, survivors wandered, searching for their loved ones, though with little hope of finding them alive. The victory celebrations, those scenes where Allied soldiers were cheered and embraced by euphoric crowds, only concealed the real suffering of those left behind to rebuild what the war had taken from them. International law stated that combatants should be treated with dignity, but what happens when the line between combatant and civilian blurs? The Nazis, with their cruel efficiency, had left indelible scars on the continent, but the Allies, with their liberating mission, also stained their hands with blood. German prisoners, those who managed to survive the landings and surrender, often faced an uncertain fate. In some cases, the rules were respected. In others, the accumulated resentment from years of conflict turned surrender into a death sentence. Meanwhile, the bombings continued. The large cities and small towns of Normandy, which had endured Nazi occupation, now found themselves under a new kind of siege. The Allied planes, with their deadly cargo, didn't always distinguish between military and civilian targets. The bombs fell where they could, and when the dust settled, all that remained was rubble. The images of the liberation of Europe, the ones we often see in movies and documentaries, show the most glorious part of the story. The smiles, the embraces, the flags waving in the wind. But those images don't tell the whole truth, only part of it. In the end, history is written by the victors, and while the Nazis were painted as villains, the heroes of this story were not entirely innocent either. The other war, the French resistance between honor and retribution. The air in France felt heavy, as if the atmosphere itself had absorbed the years of suffering. Since the Nazi invasion in 1940, the villages, cities, and countryside of France had witnessed acts of resistance, small sparks of rebellion that began to burn more brightly. The fall of Paris had been the blow that fractured national pride, but the true fight was just beginning, hidden in the shadows, organized in secrecy. June 1944 was a different month. Something had changed. The Germans, who for so long had felt they owned every corner, were beginning to notice how control was slipping through their fingers like water. The beaches of Normandy bore witness to the massive arrival of Allied forces, but far from the beaches in the hills and valleys of France, the resistance was also mobilizing. This movement, which had initially been a disjointed mosaic of groups with different ideals, found unity over time. From the communist Maquis to the Gaullists, all shared a common enemy. Sabotage, intelligence operations, lightning ambushes, every act was calculated to weaken the Germans and pave the way for the Allied forces. While the German elite drank wine in the grand salons of Paris, unbeknownst to them, information flowed directly to London through secret networks, spreading across France like invisible roots. On the morning of June 6th, as Allied troops landed in Normandy, the telegraphs of the resistance fighters didn't rest. Coded messages, transmitted from old radios hidden in the basements of farms, told the sabotage groups that the time had come to attack with full force. At a train station, a handful of resistance fighters, armed only with dynamite and the will to liberate their homeland, anxiously awaited the exact moment when a train loaded with supplies for the Germans would round the most vulnerable curve of the tracks. Silently, they placed the explosives. Then they disappeared into the underbrush. The roar of the train came, faster than expected. The explosion shook the air and the train cars, packed with ammunition, flew into pieces. The Germans, baffled and furious, launched a hunt for the culprits, but the perpetrators were already gone. By the time the first soldier reached the scene, all that remained was a smoking crater and the certainty that France was no longer under their control. Elsewhere in the country, as Nazi generals tried to regroup their forces, a small squad of British commandos parachuted down with the mission of joining the resistance. These men were trained in sabotage, specialists in turning German infrastructure into chaos. They infiltrated factories, destroyed fuel depots, and blew up key bridges. This wasn't about grand battles or victories in open fields. This was a silent, almost invisible war, where each strike further weakened the Nazi war machine. But the war against the Germans wasn't the only one being fought on French soil. With the arrival of the Allies, the resistance began to turn its attention to another enemy, the collaborators. Those French who had helped the Nazis, whether out of convenience, fear, or ambition, now found themselves in the eye of the storm. In small towns where everyone knew everyone, rumors turned into sentences. Accusations of collaboration spread like wildfire. A word, a suspicious gesture was enough to condemn someone. In the town of Saint-Lô, the baker was dragged from his house in the dead of night. It was said he had sold bread to the Germans, that he had shared a glass of wine with them. Now, with liberation so near, there was no room for mercy. He was taken to the town square, where his former neighbors looked at him with eyes full of fury. Without a formal trial, without clear evidence, he was executed right there, as a symbol of the purification many believed was necessary to restore the honor of France. In the mountains, the Maquis, those resistance fighters who had lived like bandits for years, were also settling scores. It was known that some groups didn't just seek out collaborators, but also settled personal grudges under the guise of resistance justice. An entire family was eliminated under the accusation of having betrayed Maquis members to the Germans. However, buried within the rumors lay an old land dispute that had ignited the flames of resentment. As Allied troops advanced, the cities and towns of France celebrated freedom, but the shadows of vengeance did not fade. Summary executions continued. The men of the resistance, who had once been seen as heroes, began to assume the role of executioners. In some cases, justice became an excuse for indiscriminate violence. In Paris, while the capital was being freed from the German yoke, General Charles de Gaulle returned as the symbol of a France that had never surrendered. But the capital was only part of the story. In the rural corners of the country, the scars of occupation and the wounds of betrayal remained open. The executions of collaborators continued for weeks, even months, after the German withdrawal. In many places, graves were dug in secret, under the indifferent gaze of those who wanted to forget. General Eisenhower, in his office, reflected on the role of the resistance in the Allied victory. Without them, he affirmed in his memoirs, the liberation of France would have cost more blood, more time. However, it was undeniable that the war had changed those who fought it.